Bava Batra, Daf Chavtet Amud Bet, challenge in possession, Ana בשכוני גוואי הואי. We are introduced now to a set of case studies to look at this issue of chazaka, and we've discussed chazaka as being that 3-year period of possession which establishes the owner, or the person who claims to be the owner's right to occupy that territory, that home, that house, that field, to occupy it without permission, without having to prove his rights. And therefore he doesn't even need to keep his documents of title. If he's lost his documents of title, he still can't be evicted from there. He's been there for 3 years and nobody's questioned his right to be there. And the first case study that we have is where there's a confusion about the possession. It's not so clear that he's got chazaka. We know that he's lived there for 3 years. But even though he's lived there for 3 years, the context is not very clear. And in this we have a machlokes between Rava and Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman is Rava's Rebbe, so it's quite an interesting machlokes. It's Rav Nachman and Rava, his Talmud, have two different views. What is the case? A man says to his friend, let's talk about the challenger and the occupier. The challenger says to the occupier, what are you doing in this house? He says, I bought it from you. What do you mean, what am I doing? It's my house, I bought it from you. And I've been here for more than 3 years. He says, you're right that you've been here for 3 years, but during those 3 years, I was living in the inner part of the house. You didn't have the house alone. I've been here all the time. I've allowed you to live in the outer part. So the facts are not under dispute. The facts as to what happened over the 3 years are not under dispute. He lived, the occupier lived in the outer houses, and the challenger lived in the inner houses. What is in dispute is whether there was a purchase or whether he was living there as a guest. Imagine such a situation. You have a guest for 3 years, and after 3 years he says, this is my place, I bought it, and I don't, can you prove it? I don't need proof, I've been here for 3 years, but you've been squatting here as my guest. No, I haven't. This is where I've been. That's the case. Ata kamed Rav Nachman. It came before Rav Nachman. Omale zil beror achilatcha. You have to prove that you had 3 years of unchallenged occupation. And we need to understand what that means. Omale Rava said to him, Hachidina, is that really the halacha? Hamotzi b'chavero alav haraya. Don't we have a principle that the claimant has to prove? And since the challenger is claiming that the occupier is illegitimately occupying, it's the challenger who has to prove. So that's the two views of Rava and Rav Nachman. This piece of Gemara, there is so much on in the Rishonim and the Achronim, we could spend a week of full day on just understanding this case study, and many yeshivas do. There's plenty enough for a week of material. So the challenge for me was really to be able to narrow down on one piece of it. So we're going to learn this Gemara according to the Rashbam, but even that, as you see, is not going to be that simple. The Rashbam now becomes very important for us. He becomes our teacher in Bava Batra, because as you will have seen in the middle of Kaftet Amud Aleph, Rashi stops, and it says, Ad kan perush Rashi zal. This is as far as Rashi explained. Mikan ve'elech perush Rabbeinu Shmuel bar Reb Meir. From here on, we have the Rashbam on Bava Batra. We no longer have Rashi on Bava Batra. It appears that Rashi passed away at that particular point, and although he wrote several versions of his perush on Gemara, we have, I think it's his third, certainly his last version, and instead of putting an earlier version in here, the Rashbam, his grandson, took over, and it's really interesting to see the difference in styles. The most important difference is the Rashbam speaks a little more. You realize from the Rashbam how brief Rashi is. And in fact, there's one piece of Rashbam which is on the same piece. Rashi, it's Alma Omer Rav Nachman. Rashi has 2 words on it, and Alma Omer Rav Nachman, on that same piece, we've got an overlap of the Rashbam, and he has 4.5 lines, nearly 5 lines to say the same thing. So you get an idea of the difference in style between Rashi and the Rashbam. Rashbam is Rashi's grandson, and his Talmud. So we have the Rashbam now teaches us how to learn this Gemara. So how does the Rashbam teach the Gemara? When the occupier says, V'achalti ashnei chazaka, v'avadati shtari, he is claiming, I've lost my documents, v'ata lo machita li. And you never questioned it. I've been here for 3 years, I've seen you often, and you've never said a word. She'iz daher bishtari, and therefore I didn't keep my documents very carefully. As far as I was concerned, the sale was history and it was accepted and there was nothing to worry about. No, says the challenger, I've lived in the inside. B'chadarim apnimim hayta ikar dirati v'hayiti over derech alecha. I walked through your apartments every day to get to my apartments. U'mishtamesh imcha b'vayit hachitzon, and so I shared the usage of the outer with you. I used it as my passageway, and you used it as your place of living. Shedata bo birshuti. So clearly you were there with my permission. Ulekach lo machiti. And that's why I didn't object. I didn't challenge you. Let's pause there for a while. Says the Ramban on this Rashbam. Now we've got we've got the Rashbam, and now we've got the Rishonim trying to understand the Rashbam. And they're having a bit of difficulty. One of them is the Ramban. And the Rambam says, Lo nirili mipnei sha'adin noten shelo yafsid chezkato b'shvil kach. That's not a reason to annul the chazokah, the 3-year possession of the possessor. The fact that the other man says, the challenger says, I used to walk through your property to get to my property, that's not a reason to undo the chazokah. Which means the Ramban understands the Rashbam as saying, what the challenger is saying is, you don't have a chazokah at all. And that's why I didn't challenge you, because I didn't see you as having a chazokah. I saw you just as a guest. Asks the Ramban, V'chi ein adam asui limkor bayit hachitzon u'meshayel atzmo apnimi v'derech. A person might well have sold the outer property and left for himself the right to walk through it. This is no proof. The fact that he has the inner property and that he walks through the outer property, that doesn't undo the chazakah of the occupier. In the outer property, he was living alone in the outer property. Why shouldn't that be a good chazakah? So we see from the Ramban, his understanding of the Rashbam is the challenger challenges the very existence of a chazakah. And he says the fact that you and I shared the outer property means it was never yours. This is not called possession. What did we say possession means? That you had a right to be there without permission, but you weren't there on your own. You were always there as my guest. And therefore you don't have a claim to chazokah at all. That's how the Ramban sees it, and therefore the Ramban finds it very difficult. And he goes in a different direction, more in the direction of the Rif. The Rashbam and the Rif have two very different ways of learning the Gemara. It really revolves around a girsa, the wording of the Gemara. Our Gemara says that the challenger says, Ma bait b'hai beta. What are you doing in this house? If you look at the Rif, the Rif's girsa is, Ma bait b'hai ara. What are you doing on this piece of land? So it's not about inner houses and outer houses. It's not about living in a place. It's not about accommodation. It's about a piece of land. And therefore the Rif learns that what he's saying is, I was overseas. I was in a different space. Completely different way of learning the sugya. And the Ramban veers towards the direction of the Rif because he just cannot accept the Rashbam's approach. The Ritva says, if you read the Ritva carefully, the Ritva says something so fascinating that explains the Rashbam and answers the Ramban's question, even though the Ritva also, for other reasons, veers off and goes towards the direction of the Rif. He too starts off bringing Rabbeinu Shmuel, who's the Rashbam, and then he says, V'ikshu alav b'tosvos u'v'chidushim kulam. Tosfos and many, and so we don't have it in our Tosfos, but many Rishonim challenge the Rashbam. And one of the challenges is the Ramban that we've just learned. Shezeh eino ki efshar machar hachitzon v'shiyeh lo haderech, as the Ramban says. V'yesh lomar. One can explain the Rashbam, says the Ritva. Tahachi mayri shahaya lo derech mitzad acher. The challenger had two access points to his inner properties. He could have used his own entrance and he could go through the occupier's place. So if you think of these homes like you've got in some parts of the world there, around in Toronto, you've got in lots of homes, you've got a basement with a separate entrance and people rent the basement out. So the person who's using the basement can get to his basement through his own door, or he could come through the owner's door and go downstairs into the basement. So he had two access points. V'kivan sheken v'haya over b'derech zeh, he deliberately walked through the front of the house. Harei zeh chashuv k'mecha'a. That, what greater challenge have you got than that? Why is that a challenge? He didn't say anything. He just walked through the house. But isn't that the essence of what we've learned that chazaka means? Chazaka means I don't need permission. If I walk through your house without knocking on your door, day in and day out, I open the door and walk right in and go down to the basement, and I never ring the doorbell and I never ask permission, that means I'm not asking your permission to walk through the area which you say is yours. If I'm not asking permission, it's mine. It was never yours. That's how the Ritva is understanding the issue here. And therefore it makes good sense. What did the Ramban say? The Ramban said, this is no proof that he doesn't have a chazaka. Says the Ritva, the question here is not whether or not he has a chazaka. Of course he has a chazaka, and the challenger agrees that he would have had a chazaka if it weren't for the fact that every day he challenged the chazaka by walking through the property. So it's a very nuanced difference between the Ritva and the Ramban as to how they understand the Rashbam. The Ramban says what the challenger is saying is you never had a chazakah, because to have a chazakah you must have exclusive possession. You can't be there together with the previous owner and share the space and say that's proof that it was mine. That's proof you're a guest. It doesn't prove anything. The Ritva says no, that could be proof if you were never challenged. But the mere fact that this person chooses not to use the direct access, but to access the inner rooms through the outer rooms, means he's asserting his control over the property and making it very clear to you every single day that this is not yours, this is his property, and that is a mechah. What's interesting is we could probably understand the difference between Rava and Rav Nachman with this very difference between the Ramban and the Ritva in their understanding of the Rashbam. So Rav Nachman comes along and says, you have to prove that you had a chazokah. That's what Rav Nachman is actually, zil beror achilatcha. Prove that you have a chazokah. Because if you've been sharing the space, we're not going to regard that as a chazokah. You're going to have to prove that there were periods of time that you were there alone. And that even then there was no mention, nobody said anything. But if you were never there alone, if this was a shared property all the way through the 3 years, that's not a chazokah. So the principle of motzi michavero alav haraya doesn't apply here, because you're not the possessor. Motzi michavero alav haraya means the person trying to displace the other, to claim property from another. It's the claimant who must prove. Says Rav Nachman, this man is not the claimant. He claims to be the owner. And you haven't satisfied us that you were at any point a true possessor, that you occupied that without having to ask permission. Because at all times you were sharing that occupation, you didn't have exclusivity. So Rav Nachman holds that non-exclusive possession and occupation is not proof of possession. That's not a chazakah, it's got to be exclusive. Rava holds, no, you could have situations, as the Ramban says, you could have situations where two people have access and are using the property. That's the deal. That's the arrangement. It doesn't mean that one of those two people doesn't own the property entirely. He might just have an agreement of usage with the other person, and because it's been going on for so long, there's no longer any documentation to prove it. That's perfectly feasible. In that case, the possessor does have chazakah. And who's the motzi, who's the claimant? In that case, the challenger is the claimant. So you've got to prove in that case that you were there all the time, and that every day you walked through this place and your presence was challenging him. And that way we can understand the two of them. What's interesting, as somewhat of an aside, is that the Rif paskins the halacha, and so does the Rosh, paskins the halacha like Rav Nachman. The Hilchetek Rav Nachman Bahani Trei Uvdi, in this and the next case study, the halacha is like Rav Nachman. Why? The Rava Bahani Inyani Talmid Have V'yativ Kamei de Rav Nachman. In these matters, Rava was the Talmid and was sitting before Rav Nachman. Ve'ein halacha keTalmid b'mokom harav. And when the Rav and the Talmid have a disagreement, the halacha is not like the Talmid, the halacha is like the Rav. Now, if you think back to, we've discussed several times before in understanding Abaya and Rava. Abaya doesn't feature here, but Rava does. One of the things we've talked about is that Abaya and Rava revolutionized the method of learning in their time. And their method has been adopted until today. And with that revolution in method of learning came a change in Psak Halacha. The difference was that until the time of Abaya and Rava, people used to learn only what their Rebbe taught them. They used to learn the Torah Shebaal Peh, the Gemara and the Mishnayos according to the way their Rebbe taught them. When Abai and Rava came, they studied everything that was being taught until that time. And they developed their views out of the composite of all the views of the Amoraim of the time. Since their views then were a composite of everybody else's views, from there onwards we took the later view rather than the earlier view. So if it's just the Talmud learning his Rebbe's Torah, then the Rebbe's Torah is paramount in terms of halakha. But if the Talmud has learned his Rebbe and everything else that's available at the time, then the Talmud has access to much more information and much more halakha than the Rebbe did. So we'll paskin like the Talmud. From the time of Abai and Rava, the psak changes and we start paskining like the later authority, not like the earlier authority. So why here does the Rosh say, Ve'ein halakha keTalmud b'mokom harav? This is Abai, this is Rava. So Rava's already innovated the new way of learning. Why are we paskining like Rav Nachman? Explains the Pilpula Charifta. The Pilpula Charifta is the Tosfos Yom Tov, very important parish on the Rosh in Nezikin. He brings the Rif and the Nebuchiyos, Midelo Amrinan Rava Amar Ela Amarle. It doesn't say Rav Nachman said A and Rava said B. It says Rav Nachman says A and Rava questioned him, which means he was sitting there as a Talmud in the Beis Din, hearing the issue and asking and challenging his Rebbe. Al Kocha Klomar. Even though from the time of Rava and Abaya we paskin like later authorities, that's when a later authority quotes an earlier authority and rejects him. Rava here is not disagreeing with his Rebbe. He's challenging in the question of, I have a question, I don't understand what you've said, Rav Nachman. If the Talmud is just asking a question but not rejecting what went before, we will paskin like the earlier authority and not like the later authority. So there are two ways to question and to challenge. One can question, and the word question even in English is an interesting word because it has both connotations. I can say, I question you, which means I don't agree with you. And I can say, I have a question for you, I don't understand you. When a Talmud questions in the sense of I don't understand, even after Abai Rava, that doesn't invalidate the teaching of the Rebbe. When the Talmud says, I question what my Rebbe has said, because look at all the information that we have, and based on that, I'm taking a different view, we'll pass like the later authority and not like the earlier ones.